So finally, Germany and the Netherlands. And here, I have to make sure I tell you, how these artists are going to be different because northern artists in general are going to be very, very different. We'll see this also when we look at Baroque and talk about like the Dutch Baroque, for instance. And I'd mentioned a little bit about the Protestant Reformation before, and I mentioned that if you think about going north, that these were not going to be Catholic people anymore; they were going to be Protestants. And because they're Protestant, we see them looking at much more simple themes. So I would say Protestant simplicity, that they have this. They don't believe in a lot of glitz and glamour. Something like the Sistine Chapel would have been very odd to them. Like, why go to those kind of lengths to make an artwork? Again, the Pope would have said, Julius would have said, well, because it helps teach people, sometimes you have to be flamboyant, you have to get people's attention. And again, that really stresses the schism or the break between Protestant thinking and Catholic thinking. So Protestants have a much more simple outlook about what kind of art they make and then, how they use that art, which leads you to the next point, which is that they think God is in the details. God is in the simplicity of all the things around them, or not even to say the simplicity, but in the very fiber of how everything is put together. So to them, you look at an animal, you see God's hand. You look at the living, things around you, trees, flowers, you see God's hand. You see it everywhere. To them, you don't have to go to a church to encounter God. You can encounter God everywhere, all the world is, God's, cathedral, they'd say. If you're standing on a mountain and look out over a valley, like that's God's work. So they have a very different attitude about like how one can interact with God and how one can see God. And they don't think it's really about having a mediated experience. And when I say mediated, they don't think you have to go through a church official to be inspired or see God in a sense. And again, Catholics, they liked having control over their population. They're much more structured as a religion. So again, it shows you once again the differences between these thoughts between Protestant and Catholic. And then the most important one, I think, is that their art really celebrates the everydayness of people. It celebrates lower and middle class people in a way that you don't see in Rome and Florence. To me, art in Florence was really about, well, do you have the money to support the arts? Do you have the money to commission it? And then everyone else sort of benefited from that. So the Medici would commission something, and then people might be able to see it, But here in Germany and the Netherlands in the north, you see a lot more focus on art that actual people could buy, lower class people and middle class people could buy, and they saw themselves in that art much more frequently. So it's an interesting difference between who had art made and who could afford art, let's say in Italy proper, right? And then who could have art and see themselves in the art in the north. So keep these points in mind, right, as we go along through. Now I wanted to show you a map to give you a sense of Europe during the Reformation period, around 1560. On the map, you'll notice the yellow areas are the Roman Catholic areas, and then the brown is Lutheran, right, Protestant, and so on. I wanted you to have a sense of really how the split with religion was occurring on the map. Because I'd mentioned before, if you think about like the South, they're very Catholic, and if you think about the North, they're very Protestant. And this map helps you see that. Once again, you'll notice the Holy Roman Empire, the Germanic area. So that's where Protestantism was really flourishing at this time. And you'll notice we're moving north into that area. The Netherlands, the area of the Spanish Netherlands was still very, very Catholic, but the other area that the Netherlands encompassed was much more Protestant. So again, I think this map kind of helps give you a sense of the overall scope of Europe, and then how, again, the religions break down in those regions. So the first artist I'm going to show you is probably the most well-known German Renaissance artist, which is Albrecht Dürer. And he was, like, to me, one of the coolest artists around. I don't think he gets quite the play that he should. You don't see him talked about a lot in art history sometimes, to the extent that I think he should. And to me, he's always been like the Leonardo of the North. If I ever wrote a book on Dürer, that's what I call him, the Leonardo of the North. Because he seemed to have a lot of the same personality tics and, interests as Leonardo did, where he liked to examine the world and, figure out problems and, kind of try to understand everything around him. And he was really always like contemplating the world around him. He's very stylistic about the things he does. You'll notice even his signature on his self-portrait here, you'll notice it was like a D within an A. So it's just very stylized looking. He had style, he knew how to kind of employ that style. And even self-portraiture, to think about the fact that we're looking at a self-portrait of him, shows his talent. He was extremely talented in a variety of mediums, painting, printmaking, drawing. He just really excelled in pretty much all types of art making, right, that were very popular at this time. But a self-portrait, this was something that people really weren't doing a lot of yet, because you had to own a mirror. Mirrors were very expensive. They usually were only owned by very wealthy people. So it showed that he actually had a mirror in his household he could use. And it was quite technical to do a self-portrait, to look at yourself and then paint yourself. If you're an artist, this is a very difficult exercise. It seems simple, but it is not at all. It's about truth. It's about veracity. It's about, not trying to Photoshop yourself, essentially, to show the wrinkles and the creases and who you really are. And when I think about Protestants, I think about truth. Because again, you don't see a lot of self-portraits in the South. They just don't do it. But you go to Northern artists and they seem to really love this idea of like self-investigation. Truth. What is the truth? Right? Let me show you the truth. We look at Rembrandt when we discuss like the Dutch Baroque. I'll come back to the self-portrait again. And again, remind you of Durer and remind you of this idea of truth, finding truth. And I gave you this quote from him. He says, "However, because we cannot altogether attain perfection, shall we therefore wholly cease from our learning? This bestial thought we do not accept. For evil and good lie before men, wherefore it behooves a rational man to choose the better." And I think one of the things, that people talk about is like, oh, I can't be perfect, so I give up. And he's like, well, you can't ever be perfect. Life is about learning, Life is about knowing as much as you can, for better or for worse. It never ends, it never stops, right? And so a rational man chooses to keep learning. They don't choose to throw down their gauntlet and say, there's just too much to know. I can't ever be perfect. I'm done. He's like, no, learning is its own reward. And a rational man pursues that. So again, this is a very Leonardo thought to me. We don't have any evidence they ever met, but if they did, it'd be pretty cool. I think their conversations would have been pretty cool. And Durer is very much like Leonardo, known for his notebooks. That's why I make the comparison. And in the notebooks, he did things that are similar to what Leonardo did, where he would examine the world around him. He wasn't as interested in inventions as Leonardo was, but he took great pains to study ecology, study zoology, all the things around him. He was like, okay, let me try to understand these things as best I can. So like the study of a rabbit, just trying to document, the truth of this animal. And I love the great piece of turf. It's this kind of zoom in shot of just, plants. And not even all that beautiful plants, like these little innocuous everyday plants. But he says, what if you magnify even the smallest little patch of dirt and you see in it the wonder of God, the wonder of creation, the wonder of variety, and it's this sort of sense to me of the macrocosm and the microcosm, the large and the small, where if you believe that God created everything, the world, right, well, you have to go down to he created the smallest piece of grass. And again, I think that's a Protestant thought, the macro and the micro, and seeing God in a blade of grass in a sense. Another thing I wanted to mention about Durer's talent, I had mentioned he's good at drawing, printmaking, painting. He also was a great watercolorist. And the study of a rabbit is a watercolor piece. At home, I should hear you going, ooh, oh, what? Ah. And if you're not, then I guess you don't know watercolor. But it's okay, I'll explain. Watercolor, is like a gum arabic pigment mixture. It's dried and put in little pans. And then you mix the water into the pigment, right? And then you use it to create your images. Watercolor usually is a very loose medium. You get these washes of color. It's hard to control. So if you look at this piece, it looks like it was done with pen and ink and pastels or, some other really controllable mediums. No, it's a watercolor. So you should be going, oh my God, that's pretty damn impressive, because it is. He was really good. And as I mentioned, he was also really, really well known for printmaking. If you don't understand printmaking as a process, I gave you a video in your modules. I always recommend watching it. But printmaking, basically, what it is that you create a base image. So there's the method of woodcut, let's say. There's engraving. In woodcut, you would basically gouge into a piece of wood to create the image that you wish to print, essentially. And it's a reverse process, essentially. In engraving, it's the opposite. So an engraving is done on metal plates, where you would use a tool to etch right into the plate, basically. But you create a base image, as I call it. It's your proof, or your, base image, that you're working off of the original. And then with woodcut, you would basically press, you would ink the block and then press paper to it. And when you remove the paper, you'd have a print of the image. And you could do this multiple times over and over and over again. And with an engraving, you would run it through a press. Same kind of type of transfer would happen. And again, you could do it multiple times. With prints, you could make series, as we call them. So if you've ever seen a print, you might notice there's usually a number on it. So it'll be like 1/100 or 5/50, something like that. The first number is the number of your print. So if it was 1, it would be the first. 5, it would be the fifth. And then the slash after that would come the number of prints in that edition, as we call it. So 1 out of 100, yours is the first out of 100 prints. 5 out of 50, it was the fifth out of 50 prints. So that's how prints are labeled, as far as being a multiple, let's say. Prints are very attractive to a lot of artists starting in this time period, because you could make many, many, many works, and you can make them much more available to everyday people. I had mentioned that a lot of these artists are interested in reaching out to everyday people so they could own art and collect art. Prints could be done very cheaply. So Dürer loved this idea that he could make a print and make many of them, and then people could have them for very little money. So printmaking actually starts to become, for Protestant artists especially, a way that they could have a larger audience for their pieces. Because let's face it, the Sistine Chapel's nice, but unless you're the Pope, you're probably not going to see it. So the idea of who has access to artwork, to me, is one of the first kind of conversations in art about accessibility. Who should have access to art? So I think everyone should. So I love printmaking. So again, I have a video on the process. You can watch the video and then kind of get a sense of the process. This piece is Adam and Eve. So it shows you that Protestants were still doing religious subjects every now and then, or, they still were entertaining them. But I'd argue there's a different spin than you might see with a Catholic approach to this subject. First of all, we're kind of in a Bavarian forest. If you've ever heard of Bavarian chocolate cake, the dark forest cake, the Bavarian forest in Germany is this dark, kind of forest that's kind of scary. So I feel instead of in this tropical Eden, we're in this very German forest. And in the forest, you have all these different animals, again, almost like we're in a transposed, Garden of Eden. And the animals, of course, have symbology, because Northerners like symbology. For instance, the mouse that Adam is stepping on, mice were actually symbols of the devil and evil. You may have seen Joseph shown as a carpenter kind of making mouse traps. That's a anti-evil kind of symbology. And, again, the other animals have different symbologies to them as well. My favorite is the mountain goat up in the upper right, way in the back. You could miss it if you tried. This idea of man on the precipice of evil, because what's Eve's about to do in the image? She's about to take the apple from the serpent. So Dürer kind of takes the classical idea of how this might be shown and makes it very German. Even the way he does the bodies, to me, harkens back to classical statuary and that sort of Greco-Roman Renaissance ideal, but again, put into a German context. Another famous print of his is Night, Death, and the Devil. Love this work, where you have the knight kind of representing the idea of a good person trying to make it through the world and the things that they will come up against. This idea of death haunting you. He's represented by like the cadaver-looking figure holding the hourglass to the top left, right of the knight. And then the devil as the horned beast slinking along behind the horse. You have the dog underneath. Think about the idea of fidelity and faithfulness, running with his master, right? This idea of the faithful Christian, right? You know, plodding through the world, ignoring evil, ignoring the devil, and understanding that death might come, but you know, if they do right, if they are a knight for Christianity, if they are a fighter for Christianity, then maybe they'll make it to that shining city on the hill. That if you look to the middle of the piece and up, you'll notice it's up in the background. And again, you know, this piece is really about the idea of it's difficult to do what's right. It's difficult to make your way through the world without succumbing to sin, right? Having pleasure, things that knock you off the road of you know, being a faithful Christian. But the knight is saying, it's my duty, it's my calling, it's what I will do. So these are very religious statements in a lot of ways, but you'll notice that they have like a lot of morality play within them. And again, the printmaking kind of allows it to reach out to a larger audience than you may have seen with Italian artists. Finally, to finish up, I wanted to tell you about the Netherlands. As I mentioned before, the Spanish Netherlands was still very Catholic, but the United Provinces to the north were the Spanish Netherlands was very Catholic, United Provinces very Protestant. So we're going to be looking to the north, right? We're going to be looking in the areas of like Delft, Utrecht, Rotterdam, Haarlem, Amsterdam. This is where our artists are going to be living. And this will be a brief discussion. We'll get back more to the Netherlands when we talk about the Baroque. But I wanted to show you Bruegel the Elder. And you better believe if there's an elder, there's a younger. So that's why you have to actually call him Bruegel the Elder. Because if you just say Bruegel, an art historian would say, well, which one? And Bruegel the Elder was known for doing what we call these genre paintings. Now you'll hear me say this word, G-E-N-R-E, genre. And when we say genre in art history, we mean everyday subjects. And what do you see these people doing? They're sitting, they're drinking, they're hanging out, they're dancing, they're carousing, they're just having a good old time. This is a genre work. And so what we see with Protestant artists is, again, they entertain a lot more everyday subject matter aimed at everyday people. And what we find is that middle-class people, they would buy the prints that Dürer made, and they would also buy the paintings that Bruegel the Elder made because he made them affordable and he made them about pieces about things they enjoyed, subjects that they thought were funny. Like, you know, a Dutch person would laugh about this hanging on their wall. They'd be like, well, that's a typical Saturday down at the town square, ha ha ha, you know. It's not very high-minded. It's not, you know, something over their heads. It speaks to their life. So I wanted you to be thinking about how Protestants were much more interested in these sort of everyday subjects. When religion does show up, I always joke that it's kind of a joke. Here's the blind leading the blind. Where it suggests that maybe the church doesn't know everything it should. It's not this sort of high-mindedness that you would see with a Catholic subject. It's sort of funny and hilarious, you know, they're trying to follow each other and they're all falling in the ditch. And again, it sort of challenges you to consider, like, is this pro-religion or is this like, you better think for yourself? Like, you know, it's good to have faith, but you have to understand that, you know, you have to guide your own faith. You can't just do what everybody else is doing. It may not be the right call, you know? So Bruegel, to me, he has a little humor with what he does, a little humor about what he's creating, and is trying to get you to go beyond the typical subjects to explore something very, very different a lot of the times. And again, I think the everyday people, they liked this. They felt that he was being very accessible to them and giving them art that they could truly understand.